One thing is essential. To accelerate decisions, you need innovation that fits the mission. We innovate from AI to zero trust. We integrate using open APIs that you control. We automate with smart solutions so warfighters know and act faster. Your mission, accelerated. Tomorrow's challenges, anticipated. Win faster with Booz Allen.
Hello, and welcome to the Emerging Tech Horizons podcast. I'm Arun Serafin, Executive Director of NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute. Today's podcast is going to focus on the Ronald Reagan Institute's National Security Innovation-Based NSIB 2024 Report Card. The report card provides a comprehensive evaluation of the national security innovation system, including looking at the defense industrial base, how the commercial sector works with DoD's buying practices, things like culture, things like workforce. The report goes on then to highlight some problems, some areas of improvement, and provides actionable recommendations for improvement of the challenges that it identifies. My guests today to walk us through that and help us understand the report are Rachel Hoff and Dale Swartz. Thanks for joining us today, Dale and Rachel.
Thanks for having us.
Rachel serves as a policy director at the Ronald Reagan Institute, which is the DC office of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. Before joining the Institute, she was a speechwriter and policy advisor for Senator John McCain at the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I used to work with her there. That was great. She also worked as a legislative assistant for Congressman Mac Thornberry, who's a member of ETI's advisory board. Rachel's also conducted research and outreach for a number of think tanks in Washington, including the American Enterprise Institute. Dale is a partner in McKinsey's Silicon Valley office. He's a leader in their aerospace and defense and semiconductor practices, among other things. Prior to McKinsey, Dale served in several national security roles in government and public policy institutes. Again, thanks, Rachel and Dale, for joining the podcast today.
Pleasure.
So we're going to talk about the report card. I got it here. It's great. I'm a parent, and so I want to say up front, it's not a very good report card. So I just want to walk through a little bit of it and get your thoughts on, how you made these assessments and what it means for DoD. I just wanted to stop on the first page of it. If people have a physical copy of it, there's a great quote by Ronald Reagan on science and technology there. I'll just read the first sentence. Science and technology are fundamental to U.S. competitiveness. And it goes on quoting from a message to Congress that he gave in 1987. I truthfully didn't realize he was such an advocate for science and technology. Rachel, any thoughts on that sort of that hidden side of the Reagan legacy?
Yeah, I appreciate you raising that, Arun, and noticing even the first page of the report card there, and not just skipping to those grades, some of which aren't great, like you said. Just a word on President Reagan's leadership on these issues, and I will say sometimes here at the Reagan Institute, where we are committed to advancing President Reagan's legacy and his principles, sometimes people wonder or ask us, why are you doing a project on the 21st century national security innovation base? Like, shouldn't you guys be studying 1980s tax policy or something like that? And it really is emblematic of how our organization is structured around carrying President Reagan's legacy forward. And I think, to your point, we do that in line with his leadership from his time in office in the White House. That speech that he gave, I believe it was a State of the Union address, actually, where he talked about America's leadership role with regard to research and development, with regard to S&T more broadly. And it's something where, certainly in the 1980s, in the context of the Cold War and the competition with the Soviet Union, and the way that military technology drew a lot of those conversations, that was a priority to President Reagan at the time. And for the Reagan Institute today, we're not in the business of saying where President Reagan would stand on any policy issue or political issue of today. But what we do know, given his values, his legacy, his principles that he put forward, that if there were an area in which, in this case, the domain of technology, in which we were falling behind our main competitor today, the People's Republic of China. President Reagan would have wanted us to get after that and would have wanted America to maintain its competitive edge. And so that's sort of where I see those that nexus and to connect those dots.
So then the report card becomes sort of an annual product that builds off of, trying to build off of that legacy. Tell us at the highest level, what is the report card? Why did you take it on?
Well, I'll start with some thoughts there, and then we'll would love to hear from Dale on this too. McKinsey and Company serves as a knowledge partner on this report card, and Dale and his team at McKinsey produce a lot of the analytical work that inform this report card. We take this project on because, frankly, there's no shortage of conferences, convenings, conversations about the defense tech ecosystem, about the national security innovation base for people who use that language as we do. But what we wanted to do was something a little bit different and try to add value to those conversations by taking a slightly different approach and saying, okay, instead of just admiring this problem overall, let's actually break it down into its component parts. Let's decide based on not only our expertise and our partnership with McKinsey and Company and their leadership on these issues, but also an advisory board made up of current and former policy leaders, private sector leaders who are engaged in this issue set. Let's decide on a set of things that matter, of diagnostic indicators that we'd like to see for a healthy and strong and resilient national security innovation-based ecosystem. And then through that, series of breaking it down into its component parts even further, figuring out how we can measure kind of some of those metrics that we might be able to measure and inform a fact-based analysis of each of those indicators. And then, like you said, Arun, give them letter grades. I think that's particularly useful for the other side of the coin for this policy product, and the reason why we've taken it on, which is its utility to policymakers, whether that's members of Congress, former Hill staffers like you and I, DoD officials, folks on the service side in uniform, and certainly in the private sector as well, who are partners in this work or who are seeking to be partners in this work, to say, look, here's a rigorous analysis of this ecosystem overall, where you can see some of our strengths and maybe more importantly, some of our weaknesses.
Maybe just to build a little bit on that, Rachel, and Arun, I know we'll get into some of the specific indicators, so I'll kind of hold fire a little bit there. But actually, I thought your frame on starting with Reagan on this was actually very helpful. In some ways, there's a lot of discussion and particularly on the qualitative side around how are we doing on national security innovation now, but it's not a new topic, right? Certainly, a lot of this was driven in the 80s, and it goes much, much farther back even than that. But I think the question we're fundamentally trying to ask here is lots of good activity happening, lots of great ideas collectively from a whole of society perspective, because this is not just a government problem at the end of the day. It's not even just sort of a startup problem. We'll get into some of that too. There's a lot of different actors involved in this ecosystem, and actually sort of drawing the perimeter a little bit broader than folks have been talking about it previously, I think is a helpful contribution to the discussion, but also just adding some real quantitative rigor to say, how are we doing and how can we measure it sort of year on year is hopefully part of what this product is bringing to the conversation.
Yeah, the approach, the report card approach is good, easy to understand, even for a congressional staffer. And the idea of metrics, something to measure against. I love the way you sort of piece that all together in this report. So let's before we dive in, I want to ask one more question. Who are the people that really helped build this? I know there was some staff. There's this great advisory board that you mentioned. You want to talk a little bit about the types of people and maybe some of the specific people that worked on this with you?
Sure, absolutely. So we've got kind of a small core team, both here at the Reagan Institute and at McKinsey and Company at the staff level. And then I'll just say a word on our advisory board, which is listed at the front of the report card as well. We use them really as a sounding board and to receive key inputs. Are we headed in the right direction, and what might we be missing in our analysis so that we can iterate and course correct as we go. I'll say as well that in addition to those advisory board members that I mentioned, the Reagan and the McKinsey teams conduct a large number of subject matter expert interviews with current folks sitting in positions of power in government, the DoD, commerce, Congress, across the government side of the ecosystem. And then importantly as well with leaders in the private sector, defense tech startups, some of the traditional primes, the unicorns who have broken into the space, to hear from them, what are the challenges that they're facing? What are the barriers that they're facing? Source certainly any ideas that they have, but also just make sure that we're capturing our best attempt at kind of outlining those barriers and challenges, and also making sure that we're putting some effort against solutions to overcoming some of those. But Dale, anything else you would say about sort of the who behind the report card?
Yeah, I mean, the good news here is also, there's a lot of great work happening across the board here. And as I think about kind of the data and analytics side, everything from, there's frankly more transparency that people realize on where dollars are flowing that we're able to tap into. As we think about the talent pieces that I know that we'll talk about, we're able to access sort of a broader ecosystem of kind of data and interviewing and insight and things like that. So and then so many different commission reports and studies and all of that. And so we try to keep just sort of abreast and of all of those different inputs as well. Part of what I think makes this just an interesting time to do this is there is a speed element, and the challenge that we're facing and that we're focused on just across all elements of the emerging tech topics that I know that you talk about here. Just the metabolic rate is going up so much, and so frankly, week on week, month on month, we're actually able to, in I think a real quantitative way across a lot of these different indicators, sort of measure how things are happening, which is part of why we thought it was helpful to frankly make this an annual product, because there are real year-over-year changes that are happening.
So looking at the report card, like I said earlier, as an Indian parent, I would say, the student didn't do so great. But let's be gentle about this. There were some areas where you said they did show improvement. Can you talk through some places where you feel like things are actually okay or moving in the right direction?
I'll say a word on kind of overall trends, and then maybe Dale can dive into a couple of the indicators and zoom in a bit. We've got 10 key indicators in the report card. This is our second iteration of the report card, and so we can start to look at those trends, like you said, Arun. Of the 10, only 4 are moving in the right direction. That means that for 6, they're either kind of a flat or neutral trend or trending in the wrong direction. And sometimes that can be because something bad has happened that's actively pulling within that indicator, kind of pulling us down in terms of that grade. Or sometimes it can be that in the context of the competition that we're facing across any particular indicator, there's such a need to move quickly and to make progress against our national security goals when it comes to innovation, that even if there's been no progress, that can sometimes be realized in a downward trending grade. So overall, kind of key takeaway, like you said, the grades are not what any of us would have liked to see in school or seen for kids in school these days. That's certainly safe to say. And more to the point, with a majority of the grades either flat or trending downward, I think part of our exercise with the report card is sounding the alarm a bit that, as Dale said, there's a lot of activity across this ecosystem, but where that's translating into measurable progress remains to be seen. And so we acknowledge some kind of green shoots of progress in the report card this year, but that's not yet being realized in the kinds of improvements to the grades across the board that all of us and all of your listeners would like to see. But Dale, do you want to talk about any of the indicators in particular, just at the highlight level?
Yeah, maybe just to lay a glove on a few places a room where we get really excited, or places that we think of as sources of strength or distinctiveness, as you talked about. And is a fantastic grade. It is truly, world leading in many ways. And as you've seen at the top level, there's only one A in the report card. It's an A- to be specific, but to be precise. But that's innovation leadership. One of the important things, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit more.
Before we get into that, it is a report card. You give out A, B, C, D, F. Do you want to just quickly say what are each of those? What do they mean in broad terms?
Sure, happy to. Yes. So as you mentioned, we give A's through F's, and A, just to summarize quickly, is truly sort of best in class performance. Living up to U.S. potential, it's a critical source of American distinctiveness, right? A B is a great grade. The Indian parent may not be happy with the B in school, but I think for us as a starting point, it's something to be proud of, which is there are multiple key areas of strength, but we would say, hey, there's room to keep going. You can still push toward that A, and we want to keep the bar high from that perspective. C's, D's, and F's, we're talking about basically different levels of vulnerability or inconsistencies. And C, for example, we talk about is, look, there's sort of a flat to declining trend line. Given the acceleration that we're talking about and the kind of the pace of change that's happening, for us, we think about the bar continues to rise over time. And so if you think about a flat to declining trend line, that's something we get really worried about. A D looks more like ongoing major vulnerabilities that are significantly undermining the health of the NSIB, the National Security Innovation Base. And then the F, we talk about it being catastrophic in some way, right? And there are a few Fs peppered in here as well. I know we'll talk about some of those too. But maybe just to start on a few of the areas of strength then, right? So one other important piece to the report card is we do split into two types of indicators that are outputs and indicators that are inputs. We'll get into that probably in a bit more, but just think of what are the overall outcomes that we're trying to shoot for, and then what are the things that are sort of the drivers of core innovation success in the ecosystem overall in terms of actors and things like that. So let me focus on one of the output indicators that got the highest grade, as I was mentioning a minute ago, which is this A- in innovation leadership. It was the same grade as last year. It's a great grade. It's something I think we should be collectively excited about. So what exactly is innovation leadership? Really, it is overall research and development sort of technology quality across the kind of sort of the dual use ecosystem we look at overall. And I think that's an important point. We'll get into defense modernization, which is one of the other output indicators where the grade is actually quite low. But I think what we see is in terms of technology development, innovation, driving leadership on sort of key indicators around patents and research networks and things like that across many of the critical technologies you've had on the podcast in the past, everything from AI and quantum, advanced compute, kind of next generation materials and all those things. Many of those areas, if not most, the U.S. Remains in aggregate very much a world leader on. Now, of course, we can have a discussion around that's tenuous. And I think that's where a little bit of the A- comes from, which is you have to keep pushing the forward edge. And there certainly are other areas in some of these technology indicators where we are lagging on progress. We could potentially be slowing down, decelerating. We've got peer pacing challenges across the board. But fundamentally, we do think that as you think about that as an engine of what you need from a national security perspective, that is certainly a place to remain excited, and an area as you think about deploying resources, investment, and making sure we've kind of got the best and brightest. Ultimately, that's where that shows up in that sort of core output indicator. Maybe just talk about two on the input side, where the grades are good, but maybe not the A, which is a couple of B's in the report card, right? So the first one, and this is a little bit actually counterintuitive for some folks, actually, is on innovation capital. Without going too sort of academic about this, most people, when they think about innovation capital, they're thinking about the VC ecosystem and all of the kind of private market funding that is going into startups. That's a piece. That's great. As we know, and you've talked about with folks on the podcast, that is an area that actually has been doing significantly better than other areas of sort of venture capital investment overall. A couple of really iconic big fundraising rounds, announced recently or about to be announced. And I know you've got some of those folks on the podcast, right? So we're actually doing really well in some of those areas, but it's not just the private capital side here. We are also thinking about the public markets, right? Because if you think about core investment in defense and intelligence and related capabilities. Many of those are publicly traded. Ultimately, you've got to sort of account for the shareholder equity piece of that as well, and the capital deployment that's happening there. There's certainly plenty of money flowing around in that system as well, but it's maybe one where the incentives are a little bit different. I know we'll get to that a little bit too. And then there's the government side as well, right? So thinking about these holistically in there, what we say from the good grade piece of this, the positive part is that there's actually plenty of capital flowing around the system. Actually getting funding for some of these things in the aggregate is not the issue. It is, are we deploying capital at the right stages with the right incentive alignments at sort of the right timelines in order to basically accelerate across the board?
I was curious on the innovation capital piece. There was your report card is fantastic. It provides lots of interesting data and trends inside it. And one of the things that surprised me was that VC investment in the defense sector year over year, per this report card, seems to be declining. That was a surprise to me. Was that a surprise to you as well?
No, honestly, because one of the things that we're looking at, and this is, I think, true of VC overall, is that you had a real peak that was actually happening during the COVID years, and then basically it sort of tapered off a little bit over time. So it may come off a little bit from that peak, but one of the things that we do is, like, you should really look at this in comparative terms versus the overall sort of VC market. And again, it was from a relatively lower base, but it's actually accelerating quite a bit more. It'll be interesting, by the way, to see where some of the numbers actually land for this year, because this is, all of this is, it's an input, right? So all of it's a little bit of a lagging indicator, but one of the things that we see is, depending on timing of when certain deals happen, and of course, it's a little bit of a weird market for venture right now in general, there's still plenty of activity that's happening here in general. And by the way, it's not just on the US side. We actually look and measure the US piece as well. It's actually picking up significantly in sort of key allied and partner areas as well. So the Europeans have now gotten in on the act. We're kind of talking about, do we actually measure this a little bit more broadly from sort of an allies and partners perspective, not just in the US, because increasingly there, we have a lot of discussion with European venture folks who are trying to figure out, what on earth is this whole defense and space tech thing? How do I access this? Having a lot of conversations in sort of East Asia as well with people who are trying to figure some of that out. So I think the top line number and sort of the decline there, one of the things that sort of made us more comfortable that the grade was, sort of stable and increasing is that you actually saw a lot of drivers of overall health and investment there. Now, how long is that going to last? And, how long venture investors are going to be comfortable continuing to invest in this area is a little bit of an open question, because of course they're solving for an ROI, right? And there's been a lot of great analysis and reporting and otherwise recently around the amount of actual venture that's going in versus the output coming out in terms of revenue, program awards, and otherwise for some of these startups is obviously, I think, not where we want it to be.
Yeah, and I'll preview. We'll talk about customer clarity coming up soon, which I think is tied to this issue of those perceived returns. I'm curious again, one more on this private sector investment. We often talk about VC investment. These days, there's a lot more discussion of private equity investments as well. What role did they play, do you think, in this grade? And what role do you think this private equity style of money will play in the future?
Yeah, this is a great question, Arun. This is something that I think most people are not appreciating as much. As probably preview of coming attractions is going to be a little bit of the trend here sort of overall, right? The starting point of this is, remember, this whole discussion is not about startups, right? There's a lot of other major innovation drivers here overall. You mentioned I do a lot of work on the semiconductor side. Of course, we are thinking about sort of process improvements and technologies and things like that, but that's actually not a ton of venture money. There may be some interesting things that are happening in sort of next generation AI chips and some of the design pieces there where there's venture deployment happening. But if you think about the CHIPS Act, which has a significant national security piece associated with it, and Secretary Raimondo at the Commerce Department's push to say, basically, I want sort of 10x investment in the private sector for basically every dollar that I'm putting in investment. One of the things we're seeing is actually a lot of that is happening on the private capital sort of buyout, sort of PE side as well. One, And then two, a lot of these firms are actually thinking about how do I move sort of from the buyout space a little bit more into a growth equity area to be able to participate in some of these places sort of overall. There's a ton of money out there that's basically looking for homes. And there's a lot of issues around sort of quality assets overall. And so as you think about some of the things that we need around, ultimately, a lot of this is in the spirit of building capacity at scale across a variety of different areas, which, by the way, a lot of that's really innovative stuff. And the buyout ecosystem that you're mentioning has a significant role to play in deploying capital in those areas that, like, a more traditional venture model where it's like SaaS startups, a faster cycle time and all that is not necessarily going to deploy the level of capital that's needed for, like a $20 billion fab or something like that.
Yeah, that's a big issue that's going to come up. It's the style of investment, the patience of the investor, the amount of the return. All of that is going to change the behavior of the customer as well if they want to engage with those folks. Enough on the good news stories. I want to get at what my kid did badly here a little, Rachel. So, and maybe the most important thing, defense modernization was one of the places that took the biggest hit year over year in your report card this year. It's a full letter grade down from a C to a D. Why do you think the defense modernization grade fell so much?
So that's a great question, and might be, I think, one of the key takeaways from the report card overall this year. That indicator, maybe in the context of at least how we think about this conversation, maybe the most important. It's actually indicator number one on our list, and it's one of the output indicators that Dale mentioned. And so as we're assessing this ecosystem overall, we're looking at those inputs, and then we're looking in particular at the output side, because if we're doing great on the input side, but we're not seeing it translate on the output side, then there's a disconnect somewhere, and we need to correct for that or what have you. And so this, I think, becomes one of the most important indicators in the report card this year. As you mentioned, it's down from a C to a D, now tied for one of the lowest scoring grades in the report card overall. That's an example of what I was pointing to earlier. It's not necessarily that there's been anything terrible or catastrophic that's happened under the realm of defense modernization in the last 12 months since our 2023 report card. But with the pace of competition as it is, the need to deliver on defense modernization goals at speed and scale is so great that we, along with our partners on the advisory board and the report card team, assessed that it was important to assess that downward trending grade to show that the importance for progress is so great, and the need to get there at speed and scale, that if we're not seeing, again, measuring defense modernization, we're looking at translation into delivered fielded capabilities, not just kind of the inputs into the ecosystem. That's sort of how I'd give the top lines on that defense modernization grade, Arun.
And so then if you're worried about it today at a D, two questions. How do I know what went better or what went worse that got it to a C or got it to an F? What specific things, specific actions, either by industry or government or whoever, should I be looking for?
Dale, do you want to speak to that?
Arun, this is the interesting thing about how we do grading, as I talked about from the beginning, which is the bar continues to rise. And if we don't see material progress and action in an area, the grade starts to move down. And I think defense modernization is a great example of actually how this has worked in progress. There was nothing catastrophic that happened in the last 12 months when we did this. There was not a government or industry, negligence or a big major thing to point to. All that the team is highlighting here is that we want to see more fielded capability across warfighting domains to address the threats that we have that continue to accelerate across the board. And one of the things that we noted when this was published in March was in the last 12 months, there had been no new programs of record, as an example, that specifically tied to areas that we thought were important from a national security innovation-based perspective. Now, since then, there certainly has been significant progress on things like, for example, Replicator, Collaborative combat aircraft is moving into the next phase. You have the Titan targeting program that's been announced, and many, many other things that are in progress. But again, none of those yet are fielded in the hands of warfighters. And so we have a little bit of a wait and see attitude overall, because part of the concern here in the way that a lot of innovation has been driven, both on industry and on the government side, is we're in a little bit of pilot purgatory, where things basically sort of stall at a certain phase in the valley of death, which this audience knows incredibly well. And we don't actually ultimately get to the production level, scaling level across the board. And so one of the things that we're trying to do as an output here is to shine a real flashing red light indicator on this. Now, we acknowledge there's progress. All we are saying is the progress is nowhere near where we would want it to be in order to address some of the near-term changes that are happening in the threat environment.
And again, this one ties to your customer clarity. This one gets intertwined with expected returns. And this one gets tied into even budgeting and processes and things like that. A lot to sort of disentangle and unpack there. With that,
Right.
I think we're going to have to call this part of the conversation to a halt. Appreciate you guys joining and sticking around for another part of this podcast, I hope. Thanks to everyone for joining. We'll have part 2 of this conversation with the next podcast.